embattled Congressman Matt Gaetz.
Matt Gaetz was one of the very few members in the entire Congress who bothered to stand up against permanent Washington on behalf of his constituents.
Matt Gaetz right now, he's a problem for the Democratic Party, and he can cause a lot of hiccups in passing of laws. So we're going to keep running those stories to keep hurting him.
If you stand for the flag and kneel in prayer, if you want to build America up and not burn her to the ground, then welcome, my fellow patriots. You are in the right place. This is the movement for you.
You ever watch this guy on television? It's like a machine. Matt Gaetz.
I'm a canceled man in some corners of the internet. Many days I'm a marked man in Congress, a wanted man by the deep state. They aren't really coming for me. They're coming for you. I'm just in the way.
Welcome to Firebrand Live. We're simulcast streaming out of my congressional office in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill. We have Dr. Darren Beattie, the publisher of Revolver News, that'll be joining us in just a moment to go over some exclusive reporting on Revolver.news regarding the Buffalo shooting, regarding the Ministry of Truth's demise, and actually how Nina Jankowicz really is involved in some of the most concerning globalist activities. That should be a major victory for our people. Certainly, it's a great scalp for Revolver.news. We're going to go over the craziness with the Bushes, from George W. Bush and his Freudian slip to Cori Bush and her call to use the power of government to fundamentally dismantle the Republican Party under the guise of extremism. And I'm going to break down the latest from the House Judiciary Committee on abortion and the game that is really being played in the trial of Michael Sussmann, conducted by John Durham. It's not what you think. Dr. Beattie and I are going to discuss it. But first, I want to tell you what happened just on the floor of the House of Representatives moments ago. Once again, the left's problematic response to economic turmoil returns to its default setting. FDR, Jimmy Carter, Obama, Mussolini, Maduro. What do all these unfortunate leaders have in common? Using their seats of power to artificially manipulate markets. They have presided over more economic failures and left their countries worse off when they entered office, and frankly, worse off certainly than they left. So obviously the same could be said of Joe Biden. 1 quarter into this presidency, we are in a real disaster mode, and he is probably lucky enough to forget all the crisis that he creates. Now, I just voted no moments ago on the Democrat bill, H.R. 7688. It's called the Consumer Price Gouging Prevention Act. They always name these things, the funniest stuff. The bill relies on this colloquially awarded title to unite Democrats rather than to actually help our economy. The bill would enable President Biden to issue an emergency proclamation making it illegal to sell customer fuel at a price that is unconscionably expensive. Think about that. Just a straight up price control. Now, I'm against price controls, whether they are regarding fuel or medicine or any other good, because they don't work. If price controls worked, Venezuela would be the crown jewel of South America instead of like a total hellhole, borderline failed state. And by the way, now that we're talking about Venezuela, it's important to note, breaking news, the Biden administration is simultaneously planning to ease sanctions on Venezuela, this dictatorship essentially, while at the same time continuing a sanctions regime against Russia. So quite a bit going on there, and it shows how our leaders, particularly now, are making foolish decisions. But it's not just the Democrats that have made foolish decisions. Dr. Darren Beattie from Revolver.news will be joining us in just a moment. He and I have been constant critics of the Neoconservatives and the Uniparty wanting to invade every distant land and trade caves back and forth with despots in faraway places, oceans away. And really the person that got that kicked off was George W. Bush, who made quite a bit of news with this slip, making remarks yesterday. Take a listen. We'll get Dr. Beattie on the other side.
Russian elections are rigged. Political opponents are imprisoned or otherwise eliminated from participating in the electoral process. The result is an absence of checks and balances in Russia and the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine. Iraq, too. Anyway, 75.
Did he say Iraq too there? Joining us now is Dr. Darren Beattie of Revolver.news, the publisher of that great website that I go to daily. And Darren, is George W. Bush just unable to say the word invasion without Iraq being the next word that comes out of his mouth?
Yeah, it's just fused in his mind for whatever reason. One could only guess. That was mother of all gas. Probably the greatest gaffe that politics has ever seen. Talk about dark humor. It really is an amazing moment. Not much else to say about it.
It is not a thing of the past, neoconservatism. Like, I think there are a lot of people out in the country who've seen an ascendant MAGA. They've seen America First candidates do very well in primaries, and they think, we've won. The debate in the Republican Party is over. And the reality is you've got a lot of Republicans who are using whether Ukraine or Somalia as yet another excuse to deploy our bravest and best Americans to squander the treasure of our nation, and the Democrats seem to be joining them. Like, were you surprised, Darren, that the squad has been totally signed up for this Ukraine war and totally silent on Joe Biden re-engaging in hostilities in Somalia?
That's a great question, and actually, no, I'm not really surprised at all. To me, that makes complete sense. I know there's the kind of standard notion that the left has a tradition of opposing militarism, and that is true up to a point. But things have changed, and they've changed in such a way that the entire national security apparatus, the same apparatus that's pushing us into these wars, is an apparatus that is effectively become the guardian politically of the left in the United States, to the extent that the apparatus itself has become largely weaponized domestically to target people who oppose the left agenda rather than actual foreign threats. And so from that perspective, from the perspective of actually political alliances, it actually kind of makes sense that the squad, notwithstanding the theoretical objections that the left might have to empire and war and all of that, would actually stand up for their allies and their greatest benefactors, namely the national security establishment. What's far more puzzling to me are the people on the right who still venerate this national security establishment, despite the fact that it's been entirely weaponized against them, and its new purpose is effectively to label them as domestic terrorists and destroy them. So I actually find it far more puzzling to see the rah-rahs and the salutes and just this obsequiousness and totally unearned veneration of the national security state by a lot of uninformed people on the right still. That's far more shocking to me.
Well, it's happened so fast, Aaron. I mean, when I was elected to Congress, I believed the FBI, the DOJ, the CDC, that those were the good guys. And then, like, one day we woke up and, you know, the CDC wanted the powers of the CIA and ended up with the credibility of CNN. And the FBI was willing to just become the enforcement wing of the Democratic Party. And we still do have Republicans that venerate not only these institutions in the United States and globally. I want to get to, though, what the left is doing to try to use some of these globalist entities to facilitate political goals. You've got a great exclusive piece at Revolver.news, Busted. Biden's Minister of Truth, Nina Jankowicz, participated in secret NATO-funded cabal to subvert Western democracies using disinformation as a cover. Break down the piece, the conclusions, and how people really need to be thinking about the future incarnations of these appendages of the federal government that ostensibly are there to preserve democracy, but in reality may be undermining the very same.
Yeah, so this is one of the biggest pieces we've done. It's at Revolver.news. It's still white hot. It's extremely important. It's not just about Nina Jankowicz, who is, of course, a kind of clownish figure and a clownish representative of something far more dark and ominous and important, and that is this disinformation industry. So I'd encourage your viewers, go to revolver.news and read this piece in full, and I'll just walk through a couple of the most salient and explosive points. So basically, Nina Jankowicz, with whom I've had a contentious history on Twitter going back quite some time, she attacked me for daring to point out someone called Brandy Zadrozny, who basically made a living doxing Trump supporters and ruining their lives. So we got into a little argument about that. And then a friend of mine tipped me off to something very interesting about her years ago. And that was that she was involved in this group called the Integrity Initiative. And what is this? This is really a Snowden tier leak for the age of the disinformation industry, and it was totally suppressed throughout the Western media when it came out. What this is a group, they call them clusters of academics, journalists, think tankers, national security bureaucrats, and so forth. Clusters of friendlies who act in secret, and when the time comes, they're given a signal to coordinate and conduct secretive influence campaigns on behalf of the security state. And if you go to revolver.news, you'll see some examples of how that functions. For instance, there was a case in Spain where a defense minister was about to be appointed, and now these dark regime forces decided, you know what, we don't like this defense minister. In other words, he's quote unquote pro-Kremlin, so we need to get rid of him. And so what they did was they activated these Integrity Initiative clusters from Spain, from the UK, and other places. They coordinated a Twitter campaign, and within a little over a week, this poor guy, the Spanish guy, was going to be appointed to a high-level position. That appointment was killed, and somebody more friendly to the regime was put in place. And so there are a couple really important take-homes from this. One, it underscores the point that I've been making, Revolver's been making for a long time, that Twitter is not a normal company. It cannot be evaluated on that basis. It is absolutely crucial as a playground for intel-associated influence operations, and that's its chief value. And this is a premier case of that fact, using Twitter as a playground for influence ops. And secondly, this gets to the funding of this organization. It's not technically a government organization, it's an NGO, but it's funded by NATO, funded by the UK government, funded by the US State Department. And so its motto is defending democracy against disinformation, and yet they're caught red-handed in these leaks, secretly meddling to influence the political process of a fellow NATO democracy. How about that? So that's just one example, and I can stop and have you react, and I'm very happy to go into more because all of these are explosive.
Well, they're explosive and they're repeatable. See, the key thing that viewers need to understand here is the pattern recognition. To our production team, we're getting a lot of comments about a little bit of echo in our mic and audio, so hopefully we'll get that fixed and lined up. Appreciate everyone's patience with us as we do something unique and different here. So Darren, you write in this piece.
Just if I can interject,
Sure.
just on the production side, am I supposed to be able to see you?
I don't know. I can see you.
I can't see you.
Well, I look wonderful. So now you're caught
Okay.
up. Tell me what the hornet's nest of NGOs is, because this is a key part of the infrastructure for a lot of these influence operations, to have these kind of left-wing NGOs that often have some nexus to the Soros operation or other left-wing actors globally, and then to have U.S. activities or NATO activities sort of co-venture, not for the sake of protection, but for the sake of politics.
Yeah, and you see this typically with a lot of these cutout type organizations that they're funded. NATO is a big part of this problem. NATO is a big part of the assault on free speech that's taken place over the past 5 or so years. And that's what's emerging through through leaks like this and other things. Just one little component from the leak is one of the other names that came up, a name called Ben Nimmo, who was also part of that UK inner cluster that Nina Jankowicz and also Anne Applebaum and a bunch of other winners were a part of. So at the time this leak came out, Ben Nimmo worked for a group called the DFR Lab, which is the Atlantic Council's disinformation scam cutout. And this is, of course, also funded by the usual suspects, NATO, UK, US State Department. And just to give you a sense of how incestuous this ecology is of the disinformation industry, Ben Nimmo's position now is he works directly for Facebook in a leading role to identify the threat of foreign influence operations. Here's a guy whose name that comes up in one of the most scandalous exposed influence operations of the century that's been just aggressively censored. And now he's one of the leads at Facebook to identify influence threats. So we begin to really detect a pattern here. All this stuff is funded by NATO, by the UK government, by the US government. They all use buzzwords like disinformation, like democracy. Integrity, incidentally, is a favorite buzzword that comes up repeatedly. But it's all a scam, and all it is an excuse to run intelligence-grade influence operations against domestic citizens within the Western countries, including the United States, all under this sham guise of protecting democracies against information. And although these leaks were explosive and important when they came out and were totally shut down by the mainstream media, only now do we really fully appreciate the importance of these leaks, given the emergence seemingly everywhere. The disinformation industry is probably one of the biggest growth industries in Biden's crumbling economy.
It undeniably is. And there's sort of a corollary that if they're not calling everyone a disinformation peddler, they're calling everyone an extremist, a white supremacist. And those two things run really in parallel and in concert with one another. And so while you saw the Biden administration stumbling to set up this disinformation apparatus and really failing to do so, ultimately, you saw the United States Congress passing sweeping legislation to give the FBI wild authorities to be able to investigate not crimes, but thought crimes and bad politics. I spoke against this measure on the floor of the House of Representatives. Take a listen. We'll get Dr. Beattie's reaction on the other side.
This bill is ostensibly to fight extremism, which wouldn't be so objectionable if the people it empowered weren't so damn extreme. They're so extreme that they would chill speech at school board meetings by targeting parents as domestic terrorists. Obey, accept the mandates, accept the requirements, the CRT, or you'll be punished at the hands of your own government. They're so extreme they'd leak a Supreme Court draft opinion so that they could gaslight violence and intimidation against the court. Also that the law would abandon those unborn lives and beating hearts. They're so extreme they would weaponize the Department of Justice against a sitting president over an election that Hillary Clinton lost. It was the Russians, they told us, and we were extreme if we said it was them all along. Now we know it was. The last press secretary thought that COVID discussions on Facebook rooted in science were so extreme that Mark Zuckerberg had to deplatform these people, take them away from the digital world. This press secretary wrongly tweeted that Fox News is racist. I wonder if she thinks all of Fox's viewers are dangers to the American people. Are you a domestic extremist? This bill is about whether or not you want the Department of Homeland Security looking over your shoulder at the shows you watch, the websites you visit, some politically incorrect meme you liked, some joke you forwarded, and any bad association you might have had. If you're not a racist, maybe your neighbor is, and you weren't anti-racist enough to disallow it. These things aren't criminal, of course. They're bad politics at worst in most cases, which is exactly the point of this bill. They're trying to deploy criminal even anti-terrorism authorities against what they deem as bad politics. How long until mainstream Christianity is deemed domestic extremism? You know, all the domestic extremisms, all the domestic extremists, they declare their pronouns. So if you don't declare your pronouns, maybe you're a domestic extremist too. Under this bill, how long until Facebook jail means a government file on you, a higher interest rate on your home loan, your spouse fired from their job? You know, at first I was a critic of the Disinformation Board, but it might go down as one of the most efficient government entities in all of history. It took only one action, and it actually shut down disinformation by pausing its own activities. The worst part of this bill is how it puts a target on the back of every one of our military service members. This bill will sic the FBI on our military, not to prevent or investigate crimes, but to prosecute thought crimes. The problem with our military is wokeness at the Pentagon, not white supremacy in our ranks. Even the much maligned Lloyd Austin admitted that 99% are doing the right thing. A recent DOD report showed that less than 100 people in the force of 2 million were problematic in any way. We seem so intent on a neo-Nazi witch hunt in our own battalions, while we freely send $40 billion, much of which will end up in the hands of the Azov battalion, without much inquiry. I am sincerely worried about domestic extremism, but from my vantage point, it's coming from America's political left. And you should really think about that. How domestic extremism is truly in the eye of the beholder. Perhaps the beholder of power. And power is about to change hands. Who will be the domestic extremists then? I yield back.
Dr. Beattie, where is this all going, and who is at risk in our country?
Well, that was an excellent speech, first of all. So great job. And it's one of the many joys of seeing you operate politically is to repeatedly own Lloyd Austin. It's great to see, and he deserves it, because not only are these people mediocrity, but they're operating in positions that have a disastrous impact on the country, which you described in the clip above. And it's really true, and it's more pressing than ever, this question of extremism. They're trying to say, okay, extremism is the entire GOP agenda. Well, at least they're coming out and saying it explicitly, and they're not hiding behind layers of obfuscatory language and just bullcrap like you see from the bureaucracies that are really set up to prosecute this.
Well, that's what you have to admire about the squad, right? Let's get Cori Bush's statement up, where she did just what you described. Congresswoman Bush issues a statement where she says, white supremacist violence is not an aberration. It is embedded in American institutions. Unfortunately, the Republican Party has become the party of unfettered white supremacist violence. We must take swift action in condemning it, but remember, in some, hold on, that's a little small. In order to truly eradicate it, we must call out white supremacy in all its forms, and she then claims that's the reason for the bill. So she's saying that white supremacy in the Republican Party cannot be separated from one another, and that the bill is essentially to take out the Republican Party. You got to admire Congresswoman Bush's explicitness.
Yes, absolutely. This is the thing. She's refreshingly honest, and that's one of the kind of unwitting benefits of having very low IQ people, is they're not very good at obfuscatory language, and you get these gaffes. And so between Cori Bush admitting that this is all about labeling GOP as domestic extremists, and George W. Bush admitting that the war against Iraq was brutal, the Bushes are on an honest streak these days. I got to give both of them credit. But it's a very serious issue what Cori Bush says, because I'll remind your audience that the Department of Homeland Security, where this ill-fated disinformation governance board was housed, and we haven't seen the last of this, by the way, and we can get into that. The Department of Homeland Security under Trump issued a memo stipulating that white supremacist domestic extremism is the #1 national security threat to the country. This was under Trump. You can only imagine what they think now. Probably the same thing, because it's the same people and they were just as hostile to the American people under Trump as they are now. But the thing is, it's remarkable that one of the biggest and most powerful national security bureaucracies in the country, indeed in the world, that was set up in the aftermath of 9/11 to protect Americans against 9/11 style terrorist events, has now basically said that dissidents, political dissidents, anyone who opposes the regime, Trump supporters effectively, because that's what they mean by white supremacists, they mean the GOP, that this is the #1 national security threat to the country. This is very dangerous talk, and this is the new imprimatur of our intelligence and national security apparatus.
That it's so crazy, and actually you point that out in another very, very explosive piece on revolver.news. Buffalo shooting. What did the FBI know, and when did they know it? And you write in the piece that, given the FBI's recent intense focus on white supremacist violence, the question inevitably rises of why the FBI was not able to stop the horrific crime in the first place. And you go through some of the interactions that the Buffalo shooter had with law enforcement. And I've got to say, Darren, as a Florida man, it rings similar to Parkland, where in the wake of Parkland, you had every call for gun control, every call for social media crackdowns, but you actually had someone who was a neighbor who saw the murderer preparing for this moment, and the FBI totally dropped the ball. Are you saying that as we dig into the Buffalo shooting, we may find a circumstance similar to Parkland?
That's certainly possible. There's no definitive evidence that says that that's the case, but I think it's a possibility that we have to responsibly entertain, given the broader context of what we know that the FBI was involved in. Look at the Whitmer case, the now totally humiliated Whitmer case of the DOJ is a great example. You had tremendous resources, tremendous energy. It seemed like a good percentage of the entire FBI was dedicated to this now sham entrapment operation, the Whitmer case. And by the way, as the great Julie Kelly pointed out recently, one of the informants, the FBI informants in the Whitmer case, was encouraging the Mark to write a manifesto. This is not made up stuff. This is real. And there's a history of doing this. And there are a lot of, believe me, this country has no shortage of mentally unstable people. The only question is the FBI trying to prevent them from engaging in violence, or is there, something darker, more sinister going on in terms of sometimes a crisis can be an opportunity from the standpoint of the national security state. And I think those are questions that, unfortunately, the FBI and the security state forces us to ask these difficult questions by their own established track record of conduct. So that's what we do.
We have to also ask a lot of questions about this Durham investigation. I'm talking with Dr. Darren Beattie, publisher of Revolver News. We've gone over two great pieces on the site: the Biden Ministry of Truth and its participation in a secret NATO-funded cabal to subvert Western democracies. That's driving a lot of the discussion today. Also, we have Buffalo shooting. What did the FBI know, and when did they know it? Dr. Beattie, I was called Vladimir Putin's lawyer. I was called a traitor to the country. People said that I had a tinfoil hat on when I said it was not Trump and his campaign colluding criminally with Russia. It was Hillary Clinton and the DNC that were trying to inject the national security apparatus with lies, and then they had willing participants at the DOJ and at the FBI that took this false political dirt, these lies that were curated from Russians, and they had their authorized leaks to the New York Times, to the Washington Post, to hang this cloud of criminality over Donald Trump without evidence. And now we have a trial going on that I think is a sham trial. And I want you to react to my hypothesis. I do not believe that the Durham trial of Michael Sussmann is about convicting Michael Sussmann at all. I think the entire purpose of this trial is to inoculate the FBI and the DOJ against the charge that they were in on it. If you believe Durham and his presentation, the argument goes that the FBI was lied to. The FBI were the victims. You had these evil Democrats and their lawyers scheming and obfuscating and trying to get this political dirt in. But oh my goodness, the FBI was just a victim of this. And the reality is the FBI was part of the supply chain of bullshit that ran from Russians and the DNC through the Perkins law firm to the FBI, DOJ, and then out through their distribution system and the mainstream media. They don't want a conviction of Michael Sussmann. They want an exoneration of the FBI. And whether Sussmann is convicted or not, that's probably what they're going to get. And the game you're watching is not the game being played. You think, how far off you think I am?
No, I think you're totally on the mark there. I think that this whole Durham thing has been, it's part of the reason why I can't really bring myself to follow it closely. So I'm not really conversant with the details so as to speak on them. But part of the reason I've had little motivation to look into these details is that I've always had the sense from the beginning that it was a total sham. And in the manner precisely that you describe, it's what they call the limited hangout. It's the whole purpose is to provide cover, and you can just tell by the fact that it's not really such a censored story. Like, you get a sense of what types of stories are safe and which stories aren't. When Revolver News runs stories on January 6th and you see a certain type of reaction from the regime, that's not the reaction that you get from the regime with this Durham nonsense.
Absolutely. And if they're throwing it, if the purpose of the prosecution is to inoculate the FBI, well, then, of course, you would have prosecution witnesses that would pepper in things that would queer any type of conviction. And that's exactly what we have. Put up this headline. Key government witness says Clinton campaign never told Sussmann to bring Trump Alpha Bank allegations to the FBI. So I don't believe that the goal here is to have Sussmann ultimately convicted of anything, really held accountable. Here's what I can promise the American people, and make note of this. The relationship between the Perkins law firm and the FBI was not a arm's length relationship. These entities were working together far more than you know. And there's going to be evidence of this. This wasn't an arm's length transaction of them bringing this information. The Perkins law firm is the legal wing of the Democratic Party. Everyone knows this. And during the Obama years, during the Eric Holder years, a lot of connections were made with the legal arm of the Democratic Party and the FBI and the Department of Justice, and that infrastructure was used to try to smear Trump unfairly with the cloud of criminality. So there's going to be a lot more coming on this. They're trying like cats in a litter box to cover up you-know-what, and we're going to do everything we can to expose the truth. Darren, every once in a while, we've been talking in the program about how the left sort of does us a favor at times with their most sincere moments. And in the House Judiciary Committee, we've been debating the abortion issue. The left is doing everything they can through Congress, through their street warriors, through their intimidation apparatus to try to sway the opinion of the court now that the Dobbs decision has apparently leaked. Great moment in the House Judiciary Committee, Congressman Dan Bishop questioning one of the witnesses brought in by Democrats to talk about abortion. Take a listen.
What do you say a woman is?
I believe that everyone can identify for themselves.
Okay. Do you believe then that men can become pregnant and have abortions?
Yes.
Yeah, when the Democrat witnesses are protecting the abortion rights of men who are pregnant, needing abortions, that is when the Republicans have won. But I want to ask you a broader question. You know, you've got the political matrix right now that is somewhat in flux. You have a border that is in crisis. You have Americans that are being poisoned by fentanyl at an alarming rate. You have inflation crushing almost every aspect of American life as Democrats try to find new and novel ways to print money, borrow money from China, and send it to Ukraine. And yet a lot of these kind of, I would say, culture war issues, you know, whether it's critical race theory, whether it's the snipe hunts for white supremacy, now whether it's this abortion issue, are rising in the, I guess, just in the relevance of the minds of voters. You know, as we look forward to the agenda, the legislative agenda, what are you hearing from your readers at Revolver.news about the things that are really motivating and driving people? Is it the economic matrix or is it the culture war?
Well, I think it's both. I mean, in times like these, you cannot discount the economic factor. It's, you know, it's the thing that really most directly and acutely affects people's lives. Gas prices affect people's lives. A shortage of baby formula affects people's lives, and that's just how it is. But I don't think this is really to diminish the cultural side either. I think people genuinely care about it, and like there's one side of it that's kind of ridiculous, like, oh, you know, men getting abortions and so forth. But as we're seeing from the reporting of people like Chris Rufo, is that these things have an extremely disturbing impact on America's children as well when these types of things start making their way into preschools and grade schools and things like this. I think these are things that really scandalize most Americans, and they're taking place on a far more frequent basis than anyone imagined. And so I think economics, you know, that's always front and center. You don't really worry about the culture stuff if you can't afford to pay for gas, if inflation is destroying you, if you can't, you know, feed your baby. But I don't think that's really to diminish the cultural side as well. You know, it's just such an important factor in people's lives is how they understand who they are as human beings and a society. And these things impinge upon people's families in a very important way, although not quite the same way as economics, but it's arguably just as important, I would say.
And I think the two are not severable. You know, I believe that Americans today feel under siege. You know, they feel under siege when they fill up at the gas station, when they go to the grocery store, but also when they send their children to school and their kids come back, you know, telling them that they want to change genders or that they feel, you know, like they're oppressors by virtue of the color of their skin, or that they're oppressed and that they cannot. I mean, some of the most compelling stuff on the culture war have come from black families that say, don't go tell my son or daughter that they can't be successful in today's America. We want to believe that everyone can be successful under the spirit of Dr. King, not the kind of Ibram Kendi, John O'Callamore theory that we are confined to the circumstances of our race and of our kind. And so I think that, you know, to separate these things, I think misses the mark. I think most American families really do feel like this government has failed them on one hand and in many ways is pursuing them on the other. And if you think that they'll never come after you as a domestic extremist, if you think that your access to the digital world, the capital markets, the financial world is safe, then you got another thing coming, because these people are very serious. And I want to congratulate Dr. Darren Beattie on being really one of the focal points of the opposition to this disinformation board, to this Ministry of Truth. He lit the fire, and I think a lot of people all over the country just said, we're not going to take it anymore. And it shows that we have a say in this. We have agency, and when we activate, we're the most powerful political force that exists on the planet Earth. Dr. Beattie, the website is revolver.news. How can folks follow you so that they're up on all your current content and breaking stories?
The stories we talked about are right up on the site, revolver.news. I am known to occasion Twitter now and then at Darren J. Beattie, and that's where people can find me.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us, Dr. Beattie. Thank you to our audience for hanging with us as we went through our very first live remote interview. Look forward to seeing you on a future episode of Firebrand. Roll the credits.